FreeTalkLive, Edgington Post, we'll call it whatever you'd like to call it. It's an interview that, we're at the Liberty Forum 2010, and this is Mark Edge from FreeTalkLive with you. And I kind of got this idea, listening to these two gentlemen, that I'd like to throw out a question and see what happened. The two gentlemen I've got with me is Lee Doren from BureauCrash.com. Lee, say a little bit. What about you?
Oh, well, I'm a Crasher-in-Chief over at BureauCrash. We're a liberty activist organization out of Washington, D.C. And I think that's basically all the information people need.
Excellent. And Charles Johnson, you were from the Alliance of the Libertarian Left. And you guys are a bunch of anarchists, so you don't have any titles, right?
Well, you can call me Dear Leader Czar. Every man is sovereign, right? So
excellent. So, guys, I'm going to have to ask everybody to get off their mic a little bit. Can you, Paul, adjust the volumes here? Because I've somehow got it, I'm redlining.
Yeah, let me see, where is the...
Coming from sort of the right end of the paradigm on this one, and then Charles, you're kind of coming from the left. Is that correct?
Partially correct. My general, not really concern, but disagreement with Charles is the purpose of using phrases like left and right are to be descriptive to people, to explain to them what your political beliefs are without going through and saying, a laundry list of things of what you believe. And using the phrase that libertarians are left, I think does the exact opposite of what those phrases are intended to mean. In general, my understanding is that you have one end of the spectrum where it's no government, and on the other end of the spectrum, it's the maximum amount of government. So if you can go down the spectrum, it would be monarchy, oligarchy, democracy, a constitutional republic like we have now, and then anarchy. And there were people that first called themselves, anarchists, but they certainly weren't on the right end of the political spectrum, which is true. But they were voluntary socialists. They actually experimented with this. They were known as CNT in anarchist Spain in the Spanish Civil War. And they were voluntary socialists, but in practice, they demonstrated with the oxymoronic reason why you can't be anarchist and socialist at the same time, because if one person wants to have more property than the next person, someone will come down to your home and say you got too much property, we're going to collectivize it. So it just didn't work, and so that's my general disagreement with calling it left.
So Charles, I guess the question to you is, is libertarianism a right or a left philosophy?
Well, so my argument, as you might guess from the fact that I'm a member of the Alliance of the Libertarian Left, is that I view libertarianism as a movement of the left. And the important thing at this point is simply to look at what the left-right spectrum means. And so if you look at what the left-right spectrum means, in historical context, it is, I think, exactly the spectrum that Lee was describing, that you have this spectrum from the monarchists, from people who believe that government is ordained by God Almighty, right?
Well, that's what they want us to believe. I don't know if they necessarily believe that. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
Sure, no problem. This is stuff that was going on in the context of post-revolutionary France. This was originally a seating chart in the French National Assembly, and as it went from right to left, you'd get more and more anti-authoritarian, more and more anti-state, more and more individualist. Now, on the specific question of the CNT and sort of the anarchist experience in general, I would argue that the CNT is actually a very odd example to choose in the first place. Certainly it's an example of people who were anarchists, but, and they were anarchist socialists in particular. They believed in a voluntary form of socialism. However, the reason the CNT collapsed was not because of sort of an internal failure of voluntary socialism. It was because they were simultaneously attacked from the outside by two of the superpowers of the day, by the Phalangists backed by Nazi Germany, and simultaneously by the Republicans who were backed by Joseph Stalin. And so, I mean, this is clearly an example of why an anarchist community needs to worry very seriously about problems of self-defense. But in terms of the actual practices that went on in Spain, there are many things that I would disagree with, many things that I don't think are proper translations of anarchist ideals into reality. But at a fundamental level, the basic ideal that they were trying to uphold was one on which communal ownership of land and communal participation in that was on a voluntary basis rather than on a coercive basis. Those who didn't want to participate in the commune were allowed to withdraw.
Now,
their
what
farms.
happened with the CNT, and the thing, the great irony is anyone who was at this conference who would consider themselves volunteers, they're almost a totally new movement recently, if you'd say recently, over maybe the last 50 years. The first people to call themselves anarchists were basically socialists, and people who disagreed with them they basically viewed property as theft. And they would go and just kill people who disagreed with them on that issue, and they would steal their property, which demonstrated in practice why voluntary socialism is oxymoronic, because you have to have everyone in that movement agree with your socialist philosophy. There is no individualism. Now let me get to your point on where it started with the French, where you had left and right seats on both sides. I totally concede that Bastiat sat on the left-hand side of that spectrum, but what you had on the right is almost non-existent to this day. It's basically a view that the aristocrats and people within a bloodline, they should get certain rights, and there was no view of equality under the law. Bastiat believed in equality under the law, and then what happened was that you had leftists and the farther left socialists from him arguing that, well, actually we should have equality of outcomes. So what you have now is a situation where the people who are much further to the left than Bastiat, the leftists of today, essentially created a situation where we believe in equality of outcomes, and Bastiat spent his life attacking those people. So I think to now decide now to call yourselves left does nothing else than to obscure and make it more difficult to describe what it is you actually believe.
Okay. Well, so there's two branching conversations here, and so it's going to be kind of difficult to proceed with both of them and figure out how to do that. But perhaps they can link in. So on the issue of voluntary socialism in particular, and the various forms of anarchism and approaches to things like communal ownership and socialistic arrangements, it is, I think, simply false that the first people to call themselves anarchists, certainly there were people who considered themselves socialists, but again, this is a question of what the term socialism means. It didn't mean state control for these people, obviously, because they're anarchists. The question is, does it mean some other form of coercive control, right? Does it mean the workers' militia coming in and throwing you off your land? There were elements within the CNT in the 1930s who did that kind of thing. I absolutely disapprove of that, and I consider that un-anarchist. However, if you look at the people who first called themselves anarchists in this context, the first person to call himself an anarchist seriously is Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, right? In the French context, who sort of started writing most of his stuff in sort of 1848 and immediately afterwards. Proudhon didn't believe in communal ownership of land in the first place, so this is simply not an issue for him. His position was explicitly in favor of individual ownership of land, individual ownership of the tools of production, and as he said, a society based on laissez-faire and a society based on the society of contract rather than status, is what he called it. And there are those in the anarchist tradition who, coming off of Proudhon, took his critique of existing statist accumulations of property, so accumulations of property that depended not on honest labor under conditions of laissez-faire, but rather depended on grants of state privilege in the form of state-granted monopolies, in the form of feudal land allocation, and in the form of taxation and all these other forms of redistribution that the state has always engaged in. Took from that an attempt to critique all forms of private property as a whole, not just property that was purely law-based rather than legitimately labor-based, but also sort of any form of private property. There are others, and this is the tradition that I follow, who also called themselves socialists, meaning by socialism not opposition to the free market, because they said they were for laissez-faire, not opposition to free exchange or to private property, but rather opposition to the practices of actually existing big business under the conditions of statism. So people like, for example, Benjamin Tucker or Victor Yaros would be another prominent example, Voltairine de Cleyre, Dyer Lum, a number of these other people, who are absolutely for individual ownership, absolutely for free markets, and whose specific emphasis is that for socialistic goals, if you believe that your primary interest is in the welfare of the common person and not simply in state control, the best way to achieve that sense of socialism, what they called socialism, was through the free market, was through voluntary interactions and not through sort of presuming that everybody's just going to go along, and if they don't, you'll beat them on the head. You know, not just presuming that everybody else is going to go along or else you'll just beat them on the head, but rather by looking at the specific forms of intervention that the state is engaged in right now on behalf of big business and drawing those away.